practice providing those required elements of quality. And then to develop a plan for exactly how it will be carried out. That plan has to be jointly developed with the parents of the school. What does jointly developed mean? Well, it doesn't mean a lot of things that consultation often means in institutional practice. It means joint. But the precise meaning of it has to be spelled out in the school's parent involvement policy that is supposed to be jointly developed with and approved by the parents of the school. So parents and the people working in the school need to sit down and figure out jointly how is it going to work, and we're really going to come up with a plan that we believe is going to work for providing quality education to our kids. And that parent involvement policy also has to spell out how various requirements for ensuring parent capacity, information, training, etc., so they can participate in this happen. It's not happening across the country. It hasn't been happening well since 1994, and it didn't change a whole lot after 2001. We're all focused on the back end. What do we do when schools don't achieve? We're not terribly well focused on the front end. How do we put those things in place that would enable kids to achieve? So the policy is pretty strong on that, as well as some other laws, how to use the civil rights laws towards this end, the Perkins Act, laws affecting education of kids with disabilities. It talks about both better implementation and enforcement by agencies, and it talks about improving capacity for enforcement by parents and children through advocacy and attorneys. And then the fifth area that ties back to some of what I mentioned about Title I, which is it calls for stronger student and parent voice in the decisions that affect the quality of their education. So it's a pretty full agenda. It's very much tied to research. We know that as important as looking at student data is simply saying, treating schools as a black box and saying, okay, here are the results. We want them to improve. We'll reward you if they don't. If they do, we'll punish you if they don't, isn't enough. Whatever one thinks about the specific set of mechanisms now in place to do that. It's a question of, and there's a lot of research on this, schools functioning as school-wide professional learning communities that have the capacity to look at their practice and improve it and work together. And parents and kids need to be part of that mix. Okay, so then the policy calls for lawyers to get involved in all of this. And it really calls for lawyers to get involved in three different ways. First, to seek improvements in state and federal law to protect and advance the right to high quality, including improvements in remedies. But improvements in all those aspects that I mentioned under one. Second, to make legal representation available to parents, students, and organizations seeking to enforce those existing provisions of law that relate to quality of education in both administrative and judicial proceedings. And right now, the administrative is particularly important because some of our key handles for getting a quality education, at least at the federal level, are not enforceable by private parties in court, only through administrative complaints. It's only government entities that have, and the federal government in particular, has the capacity to go to court and use courts to report that in certain areas, like the law, like administrative practice, civil rights laws. And then the third area is provide community legal education and assistance, not only to parents, students, and community organizations, but also to schools and school systems, in understanding and obtaining improved implementation of those laws that protect and advance the right. And that means not just, information and training sessions, it means actual assistance in their implementation. So that, I think, provides an important framework for involvement. And you know, those are some of the things that we're working on. For example, if we're talking about those elements of quality, and there's an obligation of schools to assess themselves, and for states and districts to help schools do that and plan. Well, how do you assess whether you have effective instructional practices? How do you assess if you have accelerated emerging curriculum? Well, we've developed some working criteria for that that can form the basis for that assessment and planning. So we are around to help people with some of those tasks and parent involvement, et cetera. But what I would suggest for here is that we take those elements of what needs to happen and use them as a lens for thinking about various more concrete issues that are now the substance of a lot of education reform and battles from which some of our panelists have had many bruises. And look at the current moment with that lens. We're now in an interesting phase where the federal government has had, I think, a major impact at a level that it has not had before, largely through the Department of Education. And from a political point of view, it's kind of interesting because on the one hand, the Department of Education has assumed a lot more power than a lot of folks are comfortable with, particularly Republicans. On the other hand, they've used it for an agenda that is very much market-driven in a lot of levels. And so in some ways, they've advanced an agenda that Republicans have been comfortable with and haven't previously been able to push. So we're seeing, for example, the use of teacher incentives, right, in which student achievement data based on outcome data is being pushed as a critical part of teacher evaluation and ultimately for compensation, advancement, tenure, or non-tenure. We're seeing, and that's at the teacher level. At the school level, we're seeing charter schools push, and there are many important functions that charters can serve, but one theory of them is charters will increase competition, and the regular public schools, charters are public schools, right? But the regular traditional public schools will improve when faced with competition. A third theory for market-based incentives is in the set of reforms, and we'll hear more about them, that are happening at state and district level as a result of things like race to the top, school improvement grants, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, in which the administration has taken what was $4.65 billion, not a huge amount, but the biggest amount that the secretary ever had in relatively free money, and run with it. And instead of providing money on a formula basis, has put it on a more competitive basis, and has put these same things in place, emphasis on charters, use of achievement data, but also has moved to competitive grant. And there's lots of different viewpoints about the substantive effectiveness about the particular reforms, and we can talk about those. What I think is clear, wherever one comes from, it's been a very effective strategy in terms of actually producing action. Now, I say that with two cautions. One is answering, did it get people to act, is different from, did it get them to act in a way that's positive? And I think I have lots of views on that. The panelists have lots of views on that. But it's not to gainsay the effectiveness question, which is important to folks like me who have long felt like we have these laws in place that are not being effectively implemented. So figuring out a way to do that is, at least in theory, a very positive thing. And the other caution I would make about it is, compared to what? What has been far more effective in comparison with is the system of formula grants, in which we have these provisions like the ones I've talked about, that have not been well implemented and have not gotten a lot of attention from state and local agencies. But that's because, in my view, they never got a whole lot of attention from the federal government. And so the same kind of seriousness about them, I would argue, is also warranted in the larger structure of formula-based grants, and I would argue would have very positive effects if taken seriously. We have this dichotomy between, as this ought to concern lawyers, between a very narrow notion of compliance, somebody said, basically paper compliance, and that doesn't have much connection to quality, and a notion of quality that is getting at important things but is toothless other than by persuasion. And I think the competitive grants is one way of getting at that, but that same breaking down that wall shouldn't be limited to our competitive grant structure. So the ABA policies don't get into any of these specific issues. They're sort of above the fray. And I think that's why it was possible to reach consensus within the ABA for their adoption without getting into, is paper performance good? But I do think that thinking about them in terms of how do they affect the front-end delivery and schools as learning communities that are able to deliver them is in those documents and is an important lens for thinking about this. So we have, just very briefly, Race to the Top, which goes to the states and is competitive. Massachusetts has a Race to the Top grant for fairly major sweeping changes that has some of these elements I mentioned. We have school improvement grants that go to the lowest performing schools, in which schools have to either close, reopen in a new form as charters or some other new governance structure, or be either replace the principal and at least half the staff, or replace the principal and go through some other fairly major reforms. And big money attached at a school level, $300,000, $500,000 per year extra for each school for a 3-year grant. And then we have waivers, in which the department, impatient with Congress not reauthorizing No Child Left Behind and having very, very broad waiver under No Child Left Behind, has said, we're going to start waiving key requirements, including a lot of the current accountability structure for states that can come in and meet some of that. And again, Massachusetts has gotten waivers. I guess 11 states now have, but many of the others are applying or will be. Some of these same elements show up there, so they're moving forward their agenda in fairly powerful ways. I will stop there. We will now hear more down in the trenches, but hopefully that provides a little bit of a lens for thinking about this. So, I'm sorry. This is.
Thank you, Francis. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. When Kay called and asked if I would participate in this panel, I said to her I'd be happy to, but you also have to extend an invitation to Tom Weber. Tom and I are joined at the hip in this work. I'm Assistant Secretary in Children, Youth, and Families in the Executive Office of Health and Human Services. Tom is Undersecretary in Education. And we have been working together. Paul mentioned bruises. We have our shared bruises that suggest that we are part of a joint